Hi, everyone. My name is Dee Hankins, and I'm presenting on behalf of Group 1 Red, and our Organization of Information System is Genomes Online Database, also called GOLD. The other members of our group are Kara Langston DeSantos, Shelby DeVitt, Molly Lawler, and Raleigh Daniel. First, I'm going to try to describe all of these acronyms and what they mean in relation to GOLD, our actual database. So, GOLD, which is Genomes Online Database, is managed by a group called JGI, which is Joint Genome Institute. And the Joint Genome Institute is a Department of Energy Office of Science user facility. And so that's managed by Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. JGI doesn't just manage GOLD as a database, it has other databases, and one is IMG, which is Integrated Microbial Genomes. And so GOLD is sort of this entry point for projects submitted for analysis to IMG. So GOLD first ensures that projects are correctly defined along with their necessary metadata before being passed on to IMG for annotation. And we'll get a little more into GOLD and organizing metadata later, but I just wanted to explain why they're organized in that way in this flowchart. GOLD isn't actually above IMG for any reason. They're both managed by the same organization. It's just that GOLD is sort of this gateway to IMG. So both GOLD and IMG are compliant with MIXS, which is Minimum Information About Any Sequence Standard. So the X stands for sequence. So there are three separate checklists for MIXS, and that's MIGS for genomes. So that's sort of what GOLD and IMG rely on. And then there's MIMS for metagenomes and MIMARCs for marker genes. And that standard is created by Genomics Standards Consortium, and which is GSC. So the Genomic Standards Consortium is made up of a bunch of members worldwide with interest in genomes. So it's not just, JGI or the DOE or any specific organization. There are actually databases all over. We'll get into that in a minute. But and so these people are from all of these different organizations, and then they create the standard together. So what is being organized? Metadata. GOLD is designed to catalog and monitor worldwide genetic studies. So that's the scope. It's really huge. And essentially it does that so that there is an up-to-date status on complete and ongoing sequencing projects. And it provides a broad array of curated metadata. So GOLD isn't organizing these actual sequencing projects. It's organizing the metadata about those sequencing projects. So where it was administered, what genomes were involved, etc. So why is all this metadata being organized? It's being organized because as it's become cheaper to sequence, this process has expanded exponentially. So GOLD sort of saw this as imperative to collect the metadata in one place as a centralized public resource for monitoring sequencing projects and their associated metadata. Essentially what it does is it promotes comparative analysis. It facilitates hypothesis generation. So, if a scientist has some ideas, or biologist has some ideas about what they want to do for a sequencing project, they can go to GOLD and look up if that's already been done, or if there are other studies that were done in that region that might inform their decisions and their hypothesis. How much is being organized? Well, as I mentioned earlier, this is a database to collect worldwide sequencing projects, but it is specific to eukaryote and microbial genome sequencing projects. So, just in a quick search, I found a list of 38 more genome databases, some that record more specific studies. One that was my favorite was Banana Genome Hub, which you can check out elsewhere. And then there are a couple of different legume genomic databases, which I thought was funny. One was called the Legume Federation, which is a consortium of scientists working to support robust agriculture for a substantially legume-fed world. Anyway, really, this is primarily focused in eukaryote and microbial genome sequencing projects, but it is worldwide, which is huge. And Gold has 312 metadata fields, and 58 controlled vocabularies with 2,067 terms. And in addition to the 312 metadata fields, there are also free text fields. So it's organizing a ton of data. So I wanted to give a brief history of Gold and talk about kind of why it was created and how much it's grown. So it was created in 1997, as mentioned earlier, with the aim to monitor all genome sequencing projects, essentially from instigation to completion. And it was just to provide the science community with a centralized database that integrated diverse information related to those projects in the form of hypertext links to disparate web-based resources. So by 2006, it had housed info on 1,500 sequencing projects. And it was, the published information seemed really proud of that. In the 7 years, it had collected information on 1,500 sequencing projects, which was a really big deal. In September of 2014, there were 19,000 studies collected and 56,000 sequencing projects. And we'll get into kind of what studies, biosample sequencing projects, and analysis projects mean. But just for a comparison, it went from 1,500 sequencing projects in 2006 to 56,000 in 2014. And then again in version 6, which was early 2016, there were 97,212 sequencing projects collected on Gold. So, as I mentioned earlier, it was genome sequencing got cheaper, became exponentially faster and easier for people to do. And so as it grew, so then did these databases that were collecting all this information. And also, as mentioned, this centralized database is to sort of provide links to all of these projects because they exist in different databases all over the world. And so this metadata is all being collected in this one place so that people can link to the other projects which are out in other databases. So I wanted to briefly also talk about how it has evolved. So over time, Gold has refined its hierarchy, and I'll talk about that in some later slides. But essentially, it has now kind of redefined what the different highest categories are. It's also added some fields like one called Gold Stamp, which is a unique identifier for each project in the database. Gold has added many data fields and attributes. As mentioned earlier, they're up to 312. And so as the standard evolves, so then does the database. And new data types have been added, which are pertinent to the properties of the organism or the sequencing project. And those have been populated with attributes or keywords that have been extracted from literature or other public sources, such as NCBI's Entree Genome Project Database. Instead of Gold having pre-created static HTML pages out of flat text files, it's now using Perl CGI scripts. So it accesses the data from a database and dynamically creates corresponding pages to the viewer's request. So it really makes it a much more powerful database. How does Gold work? So, as I mentioned, it assigns a hierarchy to classification of the information, and we'll get a little bit more into that in a bit. And it's compliant with the MIXS, which is the standard mentioned earlier, and that's to capture all the metadata associated with these projects. So people submit to Gold to have metadata created about their project, and they do that before they submit it to another like IMG. Although one thing that was interesting is it was unclear whether this was an actual requirement or just sort of a pre-qualifying way to get into IMG. And we would have reached out and asked, but Raleigh had reached out to the staff at Gold, who essentially just sent her an article that was already on there about us. And that was the article that one of several articles that we were already using to inform our project. And so I didn't know how to ask the question. But I know that, as said before, people submit their information to Gold, and then out of that, metadata is created, and then they submit their projects to IMG. So this is the hierarchy during their Gold's version 5, and it barely changes, and you'll see that in the next slide in version 6. But version 5, which existed as of 2014, had implemented a 4-level project classification system, and that was essentially implemented at that time in 2014, and that was their new schema at that time. And the 4 levels describe studies, biosamples, sequencing projects, and analysis projects. And as you can see, study is at the top, and biosample under that, sequencing under that, analysis projects. And that's because a study represents the highest level of organization. Studies include 1 or more biosamples and their associated sequencing projects and analysis projects that have been grouped to investigate a related research topic of interest. Biosamples provide a description of the individual environment sample from which the organism or genetic material was isolated for downstream sequencing projects. Each sequencing project can contain 1 or more analysis projects. So materials from 1 biosample can be the basis for more than 1 sequencing project. And analysis projects represent individual data processing methodologies or approaches that are undertaken for a given sequencing project. So if that was incredibly confusing, which it was to me the first few times I read through it, I would just say that the main thing is that the study is the highest in the hierarchy. That is the big one. And then under that are biosamples, sequencing projects, and analysis projects, all of which can overlap. And that's one of the great things about this new schema, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. Okay, so this is version 6, which, as you can see, is really similar. It's, still has study at the top, and biosample and organism are included, but it still means just biosample, essentially. And then below that, sequencing projects, and below that, analysis projects. Tiny differences in the actual chart. What you see is that rather than describing, like under analysis projects in the previous, you saw which database they would be submitted to, and that was like IMG/M, IMG/G, and here it just lists what they are associated with, metagenome or a genome, combined assembly, things like that. And there aren't a lot of differences between version 5 and version 6, but what I would say that I didn't mention in version 5 is that part of this new hierarchy, it was designed because frequently, each sequencing project might have metadata for different organisms in a single record, and sometimes the genome of a single organism is being sequenced more than once by different groups, and so it was inefficient to associate that same organism metadata individually with every project. And as of this hierarchy, it was able to define and curate those organism records and honestly sequencing project records, analysis project records, each of those with core taxonomy, environmental, and other metadata that was independent of associated sequencing projects. So as a result, they could all be used by all sequencing projects without the need for curating and propagating redundant metadata. And similarly, in sequencing projects, they were able to repeat information without having to create an entirely new record. So that was huge. So this is just a screenshot of Gold, and You can see on the left, it's pretty tiny, but you can see that you can click on studies, biosamples, sequencing projects. Looks like now they're up to 114,000 sequencing projects, and then analysis projects and such. And what I did click on was sequencing project type. And these charts here are embedded data analysis. So these are automatically generated pie charts that describe the different types of projects in the database that are now available. These include data organized by sequencing project type, sequencing status, phylogenetic table, phylogenetic tree, and biosample classification. And those are all in separate tabs there, you can see. But all of those are automatically generated from the data that's being input so that it is updated constantly. So it's extremely current, extremely relevant. You can look right now and see what is going on in this database. All right, and before getting into the user experience, I just wanted to quickly mention who it was designed for. And I know I've sort of mentioned this along the way, but really GOLD was created for researchers, biologists, PhD students. It was really created for the scientist who is interested in genomes and interested in a sequencing project. And so if you were going to do a sequencing project, you could come here and see if something has already been created that's similar. You could analyze your sequencing project against other sequencing projects that were done in the same region or of the same genome. And so it really was made for a person directly interested in genomes. And we joked a little bit about how it definitely wasn't for us because even in trying to understand what this database organized, it was really difficult, mostly because I just don't speak science. So, as just this super novice user who jumped into the Gold database and was trying to understand more about it, when I clicked on help, it brings us to a help page. And the help page essentially gives you this option to open a Gold documentation, is what it's called. Um, and opening that document, it was two really short pages of overview, which also linked you to another external document, which was one of the most current article, that one of many of the articles written about gold that we used for some research. And similarly, the article that was sent by the staff when Raleigh reached out to get any information. And so there wasn't a lot of help on this page or a lot of information. But there was a more comprehensive guide about how to enter your information to submit it to IMG. But you can see here, I screenshotted how much it told you about searching the database, and it was just a few sentences. And so really, as a novice user, it's pretty intuitive, but I think it would be difficult if you knew nothing about the database. So it seems like you would probably have to know something about the database to begin with. I'd love to be taking you through the website to do this, but when I try to record and screen share, I sound like Darth Vader. So I'm just going to tell you what happens, and you can go over there on your own if you have any time. But it on their help page, there was something called Gold Terminology, and I expanded that, and it had maybe 10 terms. I can't remember. It was very, very minimal. And then if you expanded their Q&A or their help page on the gold sequencing projects, it gave 3 very short question and answers to explain more about gold. Once again, very little information. I think this is the type of database where you know about it because you're using it, or you know about it because you're submitting your projects to IMG or another database that somehow uses gold to organize the metadata. And that is why you would come to gold, not because you've come out from the internet or something like that. So we also have a user guide, which we will have a link up for, and I believe that's everything. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to ask us. So thank you guys so much for your time.